Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Just so you know, we do have a Instagram now, so you can keep posted on what we are doing and what we are reading of the week or the month. Untangle Your Anxiety, Chapter 6. The way we begin to start turning off anxiety or our threat response is to start practicing exposure. Exposure therapy is a tried and tested approach of turning off disordered and phobic anxiety and was pioneered by great behaviorists such as Joseph Wolpe, Stanley Rachman, and Ivan Pavlov. At the core of the exposure therapy is the concept of systematic desensitization, which is a therapeutic technique in which we use exposure to de-intensify ourselves to our anxiety and our fear of anxiety. You may have heard of exposure fear or even tried it for yourself, but to not avail. However, exposure therapy is only effective when done correctly. We have set out this chapter to explain it for you in ways that we use for ourselves when setting out towards recovery. Exposure therapy is the number one therapy that helped me overcome panic disorder and begin to live a life that I was more familiar with. Pre-panic disorder, Dean. It sounds crazy, right? Expose yourself to the fear that is making you anxious. You're telling me I must go to the places I know that I will feel heightened levels of anxiety and most likely will have a panic attack. This is how I'm going to overcome the anxiety and panic? Yes. Even though our minds are trying to convince us that we should take all necessary steps to avoid any past triggering situations, what this is doing is conditioning the fear, increasing the intensity and duration of your panic disorder. This often leads to further mental health conditions developing, such as specific phobias and agoraphobia, as you try and do everything to avoid what is causing the anxiety. Dean. In the previous chapter, we discussed that anxiety is better conceptualized as a threat response, which is what it literally is in a biological sense. If you find yourself in a state of worry with physical symptoms, racing thoughts, a sense of doom, dread, and fear, and a fixation on how you feel, then this, in simple terms, is the body's threat response. I think we would be stating the obvious when we ask, wouldn't it be nice to turn off the threat response? Well, this is the perspective we need to look at it from. Exposure is not, well, just go and do it. Too many people fall into this trap of misbelieving that exposure is just a simplified, almost dismissive solution to overcoming anxiety. This is simply not true. Exposure and psychoeducation combined is an incredibly effective arsenal to utilize in challenging and overcoming anxiety, as well as knowing all the do's and do nots. I remember that I kept trying to force myself into situations to challenge my anxiety, but it never went away. Looking back, I realized I was white-knuckling my way through everything. I would always count down to the moment I could start retreating or doing my own version of escaping the situation, whether it was literally escaping or emotionally escaping using alcohol. Josh. When we know why we are doing exposure, backed up with the knowledge of reassurance that we are safe enough to do it, then that's when the real change happens. We begin a process of rewiring the brain. When we begin to notice that we can tolerate anxious feeling and sensation, this then leads to confidence in our ability to cope and speeds up the recovery process. Ultimately, the goal is to get to a place where we willfully go towards what makes us anxious, knowing how uncomfortable it will make us feel, then willfully tolerate the thoughts, feelings, and sensations. Once we learn that nothing bad happens and that we can actually tolerate it, both we and the amygdala decide that anxiety itself is no longer a danger. Secondary fear. The reason why exposure works effectively for anxiety is twofold. The first being that it turns off the amygdala in situations where we don't need it, and the second being that we unknowingly conquer a phobia, this phobia being a fear of our own anxious response, also known as secondary fear. Anxiety can be uncomfortable and make us feel scared, but it is something that everyone experiences. It is a healthy and necessary bodily response. However, people with excessive anxiety often develop secondary fear. Here are some examples of common statements from people with secondary fear. Why am I so anxious? What does this mean? I'm panicking about why I'm panicking. I avoid doing things just in case I get anxious. I hope I do not have a panic attack today. Is this sensation the first sign of anxiety? Do I still feel this derealization? I hope my pulse or heart rate doesn't increase. I check to see if I'm anxious when I'm awake. I just want to feel like my normal self again. Part of the recovery is redefining our relationship with our fear response. It's interesting to reflect on people's relationships with their own fear response, especially when you consider the existence of horror movies, escape rooms, and theme parks. Some people actually enjoy evoking the fear response because of the rush it provides. People more colloquially known as adrenaline junkies. This is why people go to watch a scary movie or to be thrown around in the air on a roller coaster or pay to experience jump scares. Their relationship with this anxious response is a positive one, helped by the fact that this belief is built upon a foundation of safety. This is where exposure helps us in the sense that not only do we turn off anxiety in the long run, but we also challenge the phobia or fear of anxiety itself by practicing being with it when it arises. The more we practice this, the easier it becomes, but we must look at how we practice it in order for it to be effective. Safety behaviors, just in case. The biggest hurdle to overcome when practicing exposure is the use of safety behaviors. Safety behaviors may seem helpful because they reduce anxiety in the short term. However, they can become a problem because they keep anxiety going in the long term. Why is this? Safety behaviors stop us from facing our fears directly and from seeing our fears for what they are. Instead, they reinforce the notion that I must do this certain behavior in order to stay safe. This continues the fear of the situation that is causing us anxiety. This is when we make choices and behave in a way that convinces us we are preventing the potential disaster from happening. You know you are engaging in safety behaviors when you do something just in case something bad happens. Here are some examples of some common safety behaviors. I will go for a walk, but I won't go far from home just in case I panic. I will attend the meeting, but sit near the door so I can escape if I need to. I will attend the party, but I'll stay by my partner's side just in case. I will go on holiday, but not without my herbal remedies. I will also do research by nearby hospitals. Every time I get a new symptom, I will Google it. I will walk to work instead of getting transport just in case I feel trapped. I will avoid the highway just in case I panic at the wheel. I will always have a safe zone or a safe person to be near just in case I feel anxiety. If any of these resonate with you, then it is helpful to label these as safety behaviors. When we were recovering, we found it helpful to categorize safety behaviors in two ways. 1. Absolute avoidance. This is when we avoid doing things for the fear of how it will feel or for the fear we may lose control in some way. This applies to people who find it difficult leaving the house, going on vacation, going to new places, meeting new people, or venturing into a new profession. Remember, to the brain, avoidance is the ultimate safety behavior. The anxious mind wants as close to 100% reassurance that the catastrophe that we fear won't happen. The closest thing we can get to guaranteeing that this is by avoiding it as best we can. For example, what if I panic at the airport? Can be remedied by, well, I can't panic at the airport if I don't go. It is absolutely imperative to remember that the sole purpose of fight or flight is to make you avoid. This threat response wants to keep you safe. However, with disordered anxiety, there isn't actually an identifiable trigger So implementing safety behaviors in response to extremely unliking what-if thoughts just confuses the anxious brain and puts us into a bad habits. Recovery starts with challenging absolute avoidance. 2. Micro-avoidance. This is very sneaky version of avoidance. Have you ever been brave enough to do something you have been avoiding, but it didn't help you overcome the fear? So you still return home feeling the situation again and again? On most occasions, this is because the brain thought we only got through the event because of a false comfort we brought to exposure, or that we tried to white-knuckle our way through a scary situation. Here are some examples of micro-avoidances or white-knuckling. I'm going to go out, but not without my bag of essential survival supplies, such as water and remedies. I'm going to go to the movies, but I'm going to sit on the end of the row. I attended the party, but I always stayed near the door. I sat through the meeting, but I kept checking the clock and counting down the minutes until I could leave. I drove on the highway, but only stayed in the slow lane. I climbed the mountain, but only managed it because I was with my wife. I managed to buy the groceries, but thankfully I had my smartphone just in case of an emergency. I went on vacation, but reassured myself that as each day went by, I was a day closer to going home. We did this for years. We used to white knuckle our way through situations, but it was all pivoted on the belief that we could return to our safe spaces. We were getting it all wrong. The whole purpose of exposure is to show the threat response that feeling anxious is okay and not a fear in itself. However, if you think about it, how can challenging exposure be anything to be praised for if we do it in a safety items, safe people, or just end up clock watching? All the brain learns is that we only survived the experience because we could get out of it as soon as possible. We were behaving out of fear, so the brain still thinks it is something to be feared. We can become too reliant on the safety behaviors and thereby more anxious if we are unable to use the particular safety prop. We may thank the safety prop or behavior for keeping us from feeling anxious. However, we would never know how we would have truly coped in the same situation without the safety behavior. So we continue relying on them and embedded our dependence upon them. Ask yourself, who is getting the praise here? Is it for me being brave or my bag of micro-avoidances and safety behaviors? Graded exposure and flooding. Now, there's 2 ways of challenging anxiety, and that's taking a graded approach, or by jumping straight in. We mostly recommend taking a graded approach to challenging the anxious response, so this requires little steps and manageable goals. For example, if our goal is to go to the mall by ourselves, then perhaps try to go to the mall and walk in for 5 minutes, then allow yourself to leave. Then increase the exposure time at each attempt. This can slowly teach the amygdala that the mall is safe. This principle applies to most phobic anxieties. Most therapists will use a graded approach, starting off with mildly feared stimuli and working up to more feared stimuli. This is usually set out in a fears hierarchy, and usually higher levels of stimuli are not attempted until lower levels have been overcome. However, some therapists use a method called flooding, in which the most difficult stimuli are introduced right from the beginning of the therapy. Scientifically, both methods are deemed equally successful. However, clients and therapists tend to use the graded approach because of personal comfort level. So, if you want to feel motivated, just go for it. Go and feel anxious and flood yourself with adrenaline and the knowledge that you know it cannot harm you. The feelings will be intense, but they pass relatively quickly. This kind of exposure is highly effective, but we understand why we would choose not to, as it can feel quite intense and overwhelming. This is why we can always practice graded exposure too. Types of exposure in CBT. In vivo versus imaginal. In vivo refers to the real-world exposure to the feared stimuli. However, sometimes the exposure is not possible. For example, if a client is suffering from PTSD due to witnessing explosions in the army, or perhaps they are survivors of sexual abuse, then the triggers cannot be assessed or replicated for obvious reasons. In these certain cases, imaginable exposure can be harmful. The client is asked to vividly imagine and describe the sights of the sound they would have heard, but describe them in a present tense terms and also describe what their thoughts and feelings are. This work is best done with a trained therapist. Interestingly, with technology advancing at a rapid rate, we have seen the introduction of virtual reality exposure therapy. Clients are immersed into a virtual world to enable them to comfort their fears. Preliminary data suggest this form of exposure is effective, internal and external. Exposure therapy can target internal and external cues. Some examples of exposure to external cues include a snake phobia or a fear of heights. Exposure work in this case would be learning to train the threat response to turn off by working with snakes and heights at either a graded level or by flooding. However, we understand that a lot of anxiety is internal. In CBT, this is called interoceptive exposure, and this is helpful for people who are frightened of their own anxious sensations. An example of interoceptive exposure would be to run on the spot to increase their heart rate in order to familiarize themselves to the fast heart sensation that they may experience during a panic attack. If you suffer from general anxiety disorder, you may be asked to purposefully induce worrisome thoughts. With a therapist, a client with PTSD can revisit memories, and a person with OCD can intentionally invoke intrusive thoughts. Early exposure therapy used to include relaxation techniques such as the exposure to certain stimuli. However, after many studies looking into the success of this method, it was concluded that it is the exposure rather than the relaxation that gets the results. For years, we tried to fix our anxiety by relaxing, but now we understand that relaxing comes after we address the problem of turning off the threat response. In fact, in some people, especially those with a panic disorder, relaxation techniques can have a detrimental effect because the person is not being induced to the physical sensations of the panic attack, thus continuing the fear of the physical symptoms panic attacks can produce. According to Dr. Sally Winston and Dr. Martin Seif, this is called panicogenic relaxation. Dean overcame panic disorder by flooded exposure therapy. His panic attacks would occur in the shopping malls. So, to overcome the panic disorder, he would put himself in the middle of a shopping mall and induce the panic response. Instead of leaving the shopping mall, he would continue to walk around, and the anxiety and the panic would increase. Did he find this scary? Yes, totally. However, each time he did this, he would notice that the anxiety levels would decrease a little, and the length of time he was anxious would also decrease. Over time, he was retraining his brain and telling the threat response that the shopping mall was not a dangerous place. It never was before his panic disorder. The only reason it became a trigger was because this was the first place he had a panic attack. Dean had never experienced anything like a panic attack before in his life, so his brain instantly associated the shopping mall with fear. During the worst part of the panic disorder, Dean would feel himself getting anxious around 1 hour before getting to the shopping mall. Just the thought of going shopping would start to induce an anxious response. The journey to the shopping mall would consist of his palms getting sweaty and his heart rate starting to increase way before he had stepped foot into the shop. This anticipatory anxiety calmed the more he practiced, and it also helped that he grew in confidence. Exposure if we are just anxious sat at home. Let's consider what we do if we get anxious at home, or at work, or in places that we go to frequently and don't avoid. Perhaps your anxiety troubles occur when we're at home just trying to do normal things such as house chores, running a bath, or watching TV. If this is the case, then we will still practice exposure and we can do it very effectively. Being anxious at home is usually prevalent in people with generalized anxiety disorder, GAD, and panic disorder. Either way, this is very common and absolutely fine to work with. Exposure at home happens when we practice sitting or standing with anxious feelings, but at the same time we commit to doing what we would usually be doing if we weren't anxious. Let's rephrase this. Exposure is when we practice being anxious whilst continuing to do what we would usually do. We stress this because a lot of people who experience anxiety at home often check in with their anxiety, monitor it, try to fight it, or even try to fully distract themselves from it. All these responses actually tell the amygdala that the feeling anxious itself is something to be concerned about, so we end up in a thought or feeling or behavior loops. Exposure happens when we say, okay, I'm feeling anxious, but here's a chance to teach my brain that I can still do what I would usually do, but allow anxiety to be there. It's as if we are temporarily accepting the anxiety, but putting all of our effort into our behavior. If we reframe anxiety in a way, we can start to make progress, which ends up in us convincing the threat response to turn off. We'll discuss and outline this further in the next chapter, Cultivating a New Attitude. If you do wish to do something in response to it in order to demystify the anxiety, then Dean suggests something helpful. How do we use exposure therapy when we're feeling anxious all the time, even while sitting down at a desk or even at home watching TV? Writing exposure in a CBT method that is used in these situations. People can sit down and write out their irrational thoughts and fears and label how likely they are to come true. The act of taking the irrational thought away from the mind to a piece of paper, taking it from the internal to the external, can have a powerful impact on reducing anxiety. Also, just by sitting through the anxiety and by labeling that you are anxious and for a certain time you will feel uncomfortable, but you know what this feeling is? It is anxiety, and it is temporary. It too shall pass, like it did in the past and like it will if it arises in the future. Dean. In conversation. Dean. So exposure therapy was the number one part of therapy for me. I used it more in a self-help way to help me overcome the panic disorder. So, as we know, there's two different types of exposure therapy. From what I know, which is gradual and flooded, I use the flooded technique. Josh. Oof. Dean. Yeah, I know. Josh. I used gradual, so fair play. Dean. The research and science behind it says that when someone goes to a therapist, they tend to go with the gradual aspect. However, when you put gradual and flooded exposure next to each other, the results tend to be the same. So, I think it's just like on an individual basis. But for myself, I prefer flooded exposure. Literally putting myself in the middle of the situation. So, I knew that I'd get anxious in the middle of a shopping center. So, what would I do? I'd drive to the shopping center purposely, even though I didn't need a new pair of socks, and I'd put myself in the sock section and let my anxiety come and feel everything that anxiety had to show. Josh. Did you find that easy? Dean. I didn't, no. The first time it was terrifying just driving up to the shopping center. I was already feeling anxious, never mind getting out of the car and getting into it. After doing it the first time, I think I probably went home, and I can remember thinking it was a total disaster and I was never going to overcome a panic disorder. And this was me, right? And I'm sure you've heard this and you probably felt it yourself, Josh. You feel that you're trapped. You feel that there's light at the end of the tunnel. You don't feel that there's light at the end of the tunnel. You feel that you're isolated and the brain almost like concludes that, yeah, this is me and this is how I'm going to have to live the rest of my life. However, I kept doing it. I kept persisting, and over time I gradually started to see that the anxious response became less intense. I kept putting myself in the situation and I got comfortable with the uncomfortable feeling, if you know what I mean. Josh. Yeah. Oh, that's brilliant. I mean, that reminds me of when I did it gradually, a little bit at a time with certain things. Some things I jumped straight in, and with other things I built up to do it. It just depends what feels right. Both are effective as one another. So I say to my clients, you choose one or the other, and just because you're doing one thing instead of the other, it still means you can get to the same place. For me, though, I remember when I was doing my exposure, and I did it for a while, but I used to white knuckle it and use safety behaviors a bit too much. And I used to get really frustrated. But when I thought, well, you know what? Take it to therapy, Josh. And then my therapist would be like, all right, okay, this is what's happening. Actually, you can do it again, but try it without the safety behaviors, a little bit at a time. So actually, there's always a positive take from it. Dean. And I think you almost see on social media as well as the short hacks which aren't actually helpful, like how to use sensory safety behaviors in response to your anxiety. Now, sometimes I'm in two minds. I don't know how you think, Josh. I think they can do more harm than good. However, obviously in the situation, it might reduce the anxiety there and then. But I don't think it's looking at the overall anxiety disorder. It is not going to be helpful over the long term, is it? No, I think one of my most interesting parts of exposure was practicing something called Interoceptive Exposure. So I used to get really scared of feeling dizzy, so then I purposely make myself dizzy and practice tolerating anxiety. I used to be scared of feeling spaced out, so I deliberately hyperventilated to make myself feel spaced out and lightheaded to practice willful tolerance. I used to do things like do press-ups so my chest would ache, so that I could get used to my chest hurting whenever it happened, and so forth and so forth. Dean. Yeah, have you ever had a positive? Have you used that in a therapy setting before? Josh. Oh, loads. Dean. So, I've heard some really good responses on it. Josh. I've marched clients up and down stairs so their heart rates increase. Dean. Yeah. Josh. Not physically marched, although that's something I should consider.